Thank you very much to all the audience for coming here today, and giving me great pleasure to introduce Ben Goosen. He's a PhD candidate to the University of Auckland, and he has already a string of publications under his belt. He's an exceptionally gifted researcher, and is very passionate about the topics he's going to tell us today. Which include, I heard, learning with flags. Yes. So, without further ado, Ben Goosen.
Thank you so much, Vito. Thank you, everyone. I'd like to start by acknowledging the first Australians and their over 40,000 years association with this land, and how privileged I am actually to be here. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my passion for some of the issues that I work on at the moment as part of research here at this university. To start with, I will just introduce you to some of my research generally, so that I can position where I'm coming from as far as this new research is concerned. I work mainly on something called, I call the problem of scale. By scale, I mean the interaction between entities, say, in a system. Scale talks about forms, like size, for example, or weight, but it also talks about structure. So it's the internal relationships between things. You can think of scale, say, the human scale. We talk about people with different weights, for example. And that could lead you to certain sort of diseases, maybe, like obesity or dyslexia. So there is really an optimal scale. There is a characteristic scale for everything. That could be any organism, living organism, or organization. Today we're going to focus on something specific, which is the scale of federal systems and the governance structures generally. I'm not going to go through the model that you see in front of you, but I'm giving you this reference and other references that, of course, will be available as part of our recording. This is recent research, mostly related to what I'm going to be talking about today. The paper I'm presenting, hopefully, with SEGRA later this year in October, is still work in progress. But this research mainly relates to that. All right, let's just take a detour, and we will talk, as Vito said, we'll talk about flags. I personally arrived with my wife here in Tumba for the first time on the 30th of June of last year. And I was supposed to report to work the very next day. And coming down West Street, I was really impressed by this view. This is the mall taking you down to the admin building. We're looking at actually at West Street from admin building. But it's these old flags that you can see at the mall taking you down to the admin building. I thought it was very impressive because it tells you that this university is international in scope. It's able to have sort of associations or relations with so many nations, even either by having students coming here to study from these nations, or because some staff come from there as well. And sometimes you also find that we have the Aboriginal and the Torres Strait Islander flags flown at this campus on certain occasions sometimes. Again, it tells you that we are acknowledging this relationship with these entities as part of our society, as part of our commitment and responsibilities at the university. Closer to the admin building, you also find these flags. So you'll find the USQ flag, of course. The second one is the flag of Queensland, and the last one, of course, is the federal flag. So far, so good, but you start thinking about some of the flags that are not actually represented here, and maybe the significance of that. One thing, for example, is this flag. Have you seen this flag before here in Tumba? No, because it's not flown anywhere anymore. The story of this flag, of course, goes back to the 1930s. And I think it has been in use, it continued to be in use until 2008, of course, when we moved out of the Toowoomba City Council to the Toowoomba Region Council as a local government area. So now we have this basically flag. But either way, you find that these are not flown at our campus. What does that signify? Does it mean that the university doesn't have as much commitment to the local sort of government as it is to the state or to the Commonwealth government? or there's not much sort of interaction between us and the local government per se. Maybe and maybe not. There are certain signs that say that there's room for improvement. But again, I just wanted to highlight this idea of signifiers. You see all of these flags flown, but really the flag of this area, this city, this local government is not. Not so in Brisbane. This is the flag of the city of Brisbane. Brisbane, of course, is its own local government area under the City of Brisbane Act of 2010. This flag is still flown in Brisbane, especially over the city hall on almost all business days. And you can see this sort of identity thing going through many other cities around the world. These are flags you might have not seen before. One of them on the left-hand side is our New York City flag. And if you can't make it from here, the sort of emblem in the middle has a date on it, 1625. And the other one is for the Greater London area. So my point is that there is this association between flags and identities generally. We could argue about what that signifies, what kind of sort of pointers you can make out of the lack of having a local government flag on this campus or otherwise. But again, the point is something to motivate what I'm going to be talking about next. Probably the most important idea I'm going to present today is this concept of the city region. Some people would tell you that this is a very complex concept as it is understood today in this modern world. But the city region actually goes back all the way to antiquity, to the beginning of civilization. And what do we mean by city region? So if you look, for example, at the Greek polis, you would find that there is an urban area that's designated as the city, but also the hinterland, the immediate hinterland around it, which is the region. The key point is that we have the hyphen between them so that they are thought of as interconnected, as they are under one governance structure, and that they have this symbiosis or the synergy between rural areas and the city or urban areas. I will be using city regions interchangeably with city, just for simplicity, but when I talk about cities, I really mean city regions. All right, let me now delve into some of the signals that we got from government on policy reform, especially when it comes to our federation. I will just take you through sort of some of the things that we have seen in press and coming out from the government in terms of white papers and reports. If we go back to October of last year, we find that this was the heading, the first sort of main heading on the first page, the Federation is starving the states. And this coincided with a speech given by Abbott at Tenterfield. And Tenterfield, of course, has very specific significance in our constitutional history because it was there over 125 years ago that we started really the drive towards our federation. Some might still say that there's nothing wrong with the federation. If it ain't broken, don't fix it. But some will also tell you that there is room for improvement. Even those who tell you that there's room for improvement might suggest sometimes that what's happening at the moment from the Abbott government is more or less really a drive towards increasing taxes, rather than actually having a across-the-board sort of view of the federation and the legal system behind it. But given the signals that we have from the other things that I'll be discussing shortly, I think that it's safe to conclude that there is interest from the government in looking closely at the federal system and ways to improve it. The reform talks about two things. Maybe I will leave that when it comes to the next slides to explain really what the two components are of this drive towards looking at the federation and ways to improve it. It seems there is considerable interest in looking at ways to improve the federal system. Griffith University publishes a biannual survey that started in 2008. And it looks at asking participants about their perceptions of our federal system. And you can see that 84% in the latest issue of this survey in 2014 thought that mostly that they had negative views about the current federal system. Preference dropped to 25%, and most people see that intergovernmental collaboration does not work well. Now, compared to other federations like the US, Canada, and Germany, even if we take statistical significance, I would say that this is statistically significant. We are higher, up at 66%, we are higher than these other jurisdictions as far as our negative views in relation to this intergovernmental collaboration. Note that this comes from the 2012 issue of this survey, 2012 version, not 2014 version. In 2013, that was not reproduced. And I'm not sure exactly why they took that, that data out. Continuing with the survey, we find the most important part here is about decision-making at lower levels of government. This relates to a principle called the principle of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity, of course, is a huge principle in the European Union. It has a different interpretation at the European Union than sort of a general interpretation where people would tell you that subsidiarity tells you that decisions should be, so it's a normative signal, should be made at the closest government level to the sovereign, or if you like, to the electorate. Of course, that doesn't mean that you don't need other levels of government, but it means that the other levels of government are subsidiary to this local government. So they are actually supporting what the local government wants rather than the local government being sort of an administrative device of state or Commonwealth governments. 71% of respondents again said that the federal system needs to be reformed. And of those that responded that way, 41% found that there's a need for creating regional governments. And what do we mean by regional governments in this context? Here in Australia, we have, of course, 6 states and 2 territories, but we have around 500, we have 566 local governments. So we are actually jumping from 6 states and 2 territories to a huge number of local governments. So this basically identifies a need for something larger than a local government. So we'll talk more about that in the form of agglomerations and people who support agglomeration. But the idea that you would need something more like a region, a larger entity, to serve the interests of a certain community or certain locale. In June of that year, there was a white paper, terms of reference, released by the Prime Minister's office. And basically, the white paper is scheduled to appear by end of this year. And there would be a green paper in mid of this year. The terms of reference for the white paper, so it's again about the same ideas that we looked at in the survey. What needs to be done? How can we improve on the federal system? It's inevitable that their drive in this white paper can be interpreted as economic. So they're looking at things like efficiency, effectiveness, how we can reduce overlap, and sort of have a better design on the correspondence between the people who actually raise revenue and the people who spend that revenue. And there are a number of principles that were highlighted in the white paper. One of them was subsidiarity, which I've just introduced, plus these other principles that you can see still more or less are economic really in nature, which is fine. I'm not saying that's an issue, but I'm saying that the analysis would most likely have to be done with an economic, a political economy lens, if you like. There was also a report from CEDA, and CEDA is the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. It's basically a think tank. And that was, again, in October last year. And they now went a step further in October and proposed sort of the frameworks or options that we can look at in order to improve the issues that we have with the federation. I have not really delineated much what those issues are, but of course you can always go back and look at the white paper and look at the survey, and you'll get a better idea of that as well. Again, the key analytical concepts we used in this report were subsidiarity and economic efficiency. We're not going to take too much time actually to critique the CEDA report per se, but I have to say still that the way they interpret subsidiarity was more in the economic sense of decentralization. So they looked at subsidiarity actually as saying that decision-making is best to be left to the individual. Because if you look at subsidiarity as a decentralization theory, you'd find that, which is something wrong with economics generally, especially neoclassical economics, is that they don't have a characteristic scale. Remember, I talked about scale at the beginning, and I said everything has actually a characteristic scale. In economics, they don't see that. You know, you can drive as much down to the individual level as, let me be clear on that, neoclassical economics, because economics is like psychology. You'll find all kinds of schools, all kinds of interpretations. The dominant mainstream economics, would, as was highlighted in the CEDA report, said that subsidiarity would go directly to the lowest level, which is the individual. But when you look at subsidiarity, which is actually its modern origin as a Catholic principle, it comes actually from the Catholic Church, and it talks about intermediate social structures, or social structures, if you like, that intermediate between the state and the individual. If you go back to the Middle Age, to the Renaissance, you'll find that these included things like cities, guilds, other community sort of based organizations that protected the individual, or sort of were vehicles for the individual actually to obtain their sort of rights and responsibilities, rather than coming directly from the higher national level of the state. And again, that goes to the idea that nation states, as we know them today, are really a new invention. They started only 200 years ago. I think the last one I wanted to, some more about the CEDA report, some of the key points that they were highlighted there. Neglect of local government, for example, and we will talk about a bit more when we talk about some of the points from literature. Again, lack of certainty over tax revenue, and the need for agglomerations. So some people highlighted the position on, for example, Brisbane as a united city. It has one local government area, compared to cities like Sydney or Melbourne, where they have, like in Sydney, I think they have 26 cities. So they don't have really an agglomeration of one big, sort of a regional kind of government structure. The most recent sort of issue on this reforming the federation is a COAG and Federal Financial Relations paper. COAG, of course, is the Council of Australian Governments, and it has been very active on both the white paper for federation and an associated paper on reforming the tax system. And these two are going to be coming out together by end of this year, and they will be sort of informing each other. This paper basically talks about, again, the building blocks of what's being proposed. So you'd find that there's an institutional framework dimension to this research, and the other one is a federal fiscal system dimension. So the first one basically is on the white paper on federation. The second one would be on the white paper on the tax system. Key principles that the paper invokes and talks about are the principle of democratic accountability and the committee principle. The committee principle was discussed basically in relation to the context in Germany. So they cited Germany as an example of this committee principle, which basically that they have something called cooperative federalism. The idea that different levels of government are seen as co-equal, rather than having this system of, having top-down or hierarchical approach. They also talked about Switzerland and other jurisdictions in that paper. But a point I wanted really to take out and highlight from this paper is from the IMF, International Monetary Fund. We hate the International Monetary Fund. I'm sure that many have heard a lot about the IMF, but this point I think is a valuable one, and I hope I'm not being, critiqued for being selective, but again, I'm driving my advocacy here. The whole objective is really to highlight the importance of city regions. So they say giving sufficient revenue autonomy to subnational governments is a critical condition for success in containing expenditure. So the idea that when we have this vertical fiscal imbalance, we find that certain tiers of government, especially the states, have more expenditure than their revenue. They are telling you that it's very important for you to give them sufficient revenue autonomy, and this applies also to local government, so that they can match their revenue to their expenditure. So it's really the idea of empowering city regions that I will discuss in more detail shortly. I'm going to touch upon just some ideas from literature. There's much more out there on these issues, but you might find some of this useful to what I'm going to propose. I'm going to give you 4 propositions at the end. I call them propositions. You can call them contentions or whatever, because I'm still, as I said, work in progress, and my interest is really to put these ideas out there and get feedback. All right. The first person is Gerald Frug. Gerald Frug is a law professor at Harvard. He has worked for decades now on the area of local government law. And in more recent years, he talked about the architecture of government. If you Google him, you'll find that he had delivered 2 important, actually, lectures in Canada, in Montreal, and in London, the London School of Economics, about the architecture of governance. And what he is indicating is that there is an emerging trend now called international local government law. No contradiction there. It's international and local, in the sense that up to the 1960s, 1970s of the previous century, the 1960s and 1970s, we found that international law was blind to anything that's underneath the sovereign state, the national state, in the sense that the only international players were the national states. That's why all sub-national governments were treated pretty much as minors, in the sense that they are not given much room to maneuver or to walk in, because they think, and truly that was right at the time, if they do something that is in opposition to international law, who's going to be responsible for that? It's not going to be the city or the state. It's going to be actually the national government, because they are the ones that are guiding or leading this international system. Now this is changing. What's happening now is that we are getting international organizations, international instruments, including the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, that are interested in the relationship, in defining the relationship between subnational governments and national governments. He cites, of course, a number of cases about cities that challenge their national governments based on responsibilities in relation to international law. Things like environmental law, in land use, for example, and even in human rights areas. So the point I'm trying to get across is that now, today, we see that there is more interest from international law in things that are underneath the radar previously, especially cities and local government and even states. Okay? I myself actually worked with the International Association of Constitutional Law for quite a number of years now, and I am part of something called the subnational constitutionalism stream. The International Association of Constitutional Law is a huge consortium. It meets once every 4 years, a congress. The last time it was in Oslo. And I was represented in that subnational constitutionalism. So if you're interested in that, you Google that, or you Google something called Perspective on Federalism, and you'll find a lot of papers that talk about subnational constitutionalism and the importance of that moving forward in globalization, in a globalizing world. The second person is Benjamin Barber. Both of these gentlemen are from the US and work in New York. Barber, at the moment, I think he's a research fellow with New York City, the University of City University of New York, I think. He is a political scientist. His most recent publication was a book called "If Mayors Ruled the World." If Mayors Ruled the World. And he basically advocates the idea that nation states are incapable of producing solutions to the problems we see in the world today. But when you compare that to mayors, and we're talking about mayors especially of larger cities, like New York City, like London, like Moscow, you'll find that they are the ones that are really able to produce results on the ground. I would also mention that both him and I think Frug as well have TED Talks. So if you know about TED Talk, you can go to TED Talk and research them there, and you'll find some TED Talk that I've given about these subjects. And I come to Paul Romer, who's an economist, mostly known about his growth theories, indigenous growth theories. But he also wrote about charter cities, or worked on charter cities. A main difference of what I'm actually thinking about and researching at the moment is that Romer is talking about charter cities as greenfield developments. You go to a place where there's no one and you build something from scratch. You'll find it in places around the world these days. But you don't have to do that. You can actually take existing cities and build around them an agglomeration and give them empowerment that could become a form of a charter city. Let me then introduce to you the next ideas from Asher Judah. He's an Australian. He's a public policy advisor, both to industry and to government. And he just published a book called The Australian Century. For once now, we can see that some people at least starting to think of Australia maybe as a superpower, maybe in 100, 200 years. But we see ourselves as a possible alternative to simply an Asian sort of economic domination. Asher Judah talks about things, again, the problems with our local governments. But look at the second bullet here. 80% of our GDP comes from 18 cities. And 75% of all jobs. So when you talk about reforming the federation, it's very important to remember that the federation really, as Asher puts it as well, is an archipelago. While we look at the map, we see that we have a huge continent. In reality, what we are really is an archipelago of cities around the coast. Another point that I was just talking to Vito about before coming here, he was telling me about how in the UK you can get data about revenue generated by cities. So there are statistical series that you can access. Not so in Australia. I've called the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, asking about how much actually tax revenue is generated from the Toowoomba region. I have to do some more research to get these data, so to make up this data basically based on assumptions. But I can't actually access any data series that's generated by the ABS that would tell you that this is how much was generated in tax revenue on income tax, and that's how much was given to Commonwealth or back to states and so on. Just quickly, I want to emphasize the point. This is, for example, what Asher talks about in Sydney. He talks about something called the Cumberland Island. He's telling us that beyond this really island, you really don't have much happening in Australia, at least in that region, in that area. He gives you also similar sort of images, similar sort of constructions for islands closer to metropolitan or greater Melbourne and greater Brisbane and so on. This is the area, of course, as you would see it on a map, but he's telling us basically that beyond this area here, it's pretty much like water. It's not reclaimed. It's as if you have offshore mining, offshore operations and so on, but people don't really live there. And it doesn't match perfectly well with the existing local government structures. So he's talking again about amalgamation of a larger sort of entity from the existing local government areas. I want to drive this point further by showing you Australia at night. And as you can see from the lights taken from a satellite image, you can see that there are these clusters of light. You can tell immediately what they are. Beyond them, there's really not much happening. I'm talking about things economic here, right? But again, if you read, for example, Charles Beard, you'll find that constitutions are always driven by economic considerations, including a federal system. Compare this to what's happening here. This is what you have, of course, the US and Europe. And you can see the complete difference between them and Africa. They're down there at the bottom of this image, or as seen here. There is no lights at all in Africa. Not because there are no people. There is 1 billion people living there. So it's not just a matter of saying, oh, because we don't have people in Australia, maybe we should actually have a huge number of immigrants coming here, and that would solve this issue of economic development. It's really the ability of understanding how you group these people, how are they going to be organized when they come to this country. Here's, for example, India. India is completely lit, but the problem is, again, that it is not as rich, if you like, or not as prosperous as countries in the US and in Europe. So again, my point here is that immigration has to be targeted. Again, these are conjectures at the moment. Something like immigration probably should be, if at least, a joint function between local government and the Commonwealth, because you have to actually embed immigrants in certain local areas with certain jobs or certain opportunities. Some of the analytical framework I'm using at the moment can be summarized in this slide. So we're saying that there are 3 types of cities. Extremes would be the 2 sort of cities at the bottom and the top. And we have basically 2 dimensions. One of them is economic independence, and the other is political independence. At the bottom, you would see a territorial city. So a territorial city like Tumba. It has low economic independence, as well as low political independence. The extreme, of course, the other extreme would be the city-state, like Singapore, for example. It has complete economic independence and complete political independence. But in between, you have this huge area, continuum of what you could call charter cities. Charter cities not necessarily would have symmetrical economic and political independence. Some of them would have more economic, some would have less or more political, but we would still account for them as charter cities. Just quickly, let me talk about the legal personality of cities. This is a huge area, but I want to touch upon it because I want to explain what happened to cities over history. If you go back and talk about the earliest civilizations, like Sumer, for example, you'll find that they all started with this idea of city-states. So cities were really independent with very huge economic and political identities. Later on, over time, you found that they gravitated more to charter cities with less independence, and eventually to territorial cities as we see them today. What happened in the UK is particularly of interest because, again, of our heritage and historical links with them. So we have to talk about something called the quo warranto. And the quo warranto is basically an illegal writ, similar to what we call today the ultra vires principle. So if you have any government or agency, government agency, public agency that issues a certain decision, you could challenge it on the fact that they have actually taken the decision outside their jurisdiction. So that's not actually their area of sort of responsibility. The particular quo warranto we're interested in is from 1684, so just before the Glorious Revolution. And this was a quo warranto issued by Charles II against the City of London, where he demanded that the city the charter of that city be returned back to him, to be forfeited, because of things that they have done that he argued basically that were ultra vires. So the king, basically the crown, argued that there's something called the fiction theory or the concession theory, and based on which the rights given to a city or the rights given to a local government are actually concessions. They come only from the state. They come only from the statute that established that local government. That was the crown's argument. The city argued the realist theory. They said that the city actually is an organic reality on the ground. It has intrinsic, inherent rights that cannot be alienated. Of course, the king won, and the charter was forfeited. But then we had the Glorious Revolution in 1688, and an act of parliament was passed reversing that decision. And that was not the only thing that happened there, because this also affected cities in other areas in the world, like the New England colonies. In the same drive, the New England colonies had charters. These charters were forfeited, and they decided to have them all integrated, amalgamated, if you like, into the New England Dominion. But because of the revolution, they were able to cancel the Dominion. It was dissolved, and they were able to take back their charters. And of course, you all probably know that New England was the nucleus for imagining later on what came to be known as the United States of America. They had the Constitution that sort of was the pilot or the blueprint for the Constitution that followed for the United States. Again, the point that cities now are becoming international actors. Cities are not simply hidden behind nation states. They are going out and are actually affecting international policies on their own. For example, there was a world city hypothesis by John Friedman, who's Austrian, that talked about the idea that the world really is you can combine it with the world systems from Immanuel Wallerstein, that talked about world cities as the nodes in a globalization sort of process in a world system. I will talk more about the importance of world cities in relation to Australia shortly. I'm getting to the end of my time, so I will just take a few more minutes to go quickly about what the propositions I want to make. This is a network called the Globalization and World Cities Network from one of the universities in the UK. And it lists basically the most complex economies. I've listed actually the most complex economies, but they list actually rankings of cities based on their interconnectivity with globalization. So you'll have alpha plus plus cities like London and New York. There are only two. And then they go down from alpha plus plus to alpha plus and so on until until gamma. And you can see how many, for example, Germany has compared to others, but always remember the scale. If you look at the area and the population, you will find that there, at least when we forward, for example, to Australia, we are not faring as good as these countries are. We don't have as many alpha, if you like, or beta and gamma cities compared to these other complex economies. But maybe the most important point in relation to this, of course, you have the UK up there. Here is the United States. Of course, the United States is very large compared even to Australia, so you have to take that into account. But compare, for example, the United States to China, and they both have the same sort of area. Here is China. So the United States would have something like 30 cities, ranked alpha, beta, and gamma, compared only to 6 for China, including Hong Kong. So that gives you an idea as well of sort of the strength of their economies in a comparative sense. I want to go into something with the propositions, something called the Economic Complexity Index. And the disturbing point that I want to make here is Australia's ranking there. These are the most complex economies in the world, based on their abilities to leverage knowledge to create new products and services. Australia comes 79 out of 86, just above Zimbabwe and just below Chile. Compared to other countries, we are doing very bad. And you would know why that is, because we are mostly dependent on raw materials. But that's something that cannot continue in the future, especially if we are looking forward to an Australian century. And this is probably one of the most important things we need to think about when we think about the problems with the current federal system and how that could be improved. The first actually proposition was basically that the richest countries are economically complex. At least when you look at it as a long-term projection. Complex economies also require walled cities, so the idea of innovation. And when you look at innovation with Australia, again, the most complex economies and their cities and their rankings in the top 100, and you go and look at Australia, it has only Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. All other states, and remember, these are all capital cities, by the way. So, in fact, I could even say that Queensland is a city-state in that sense, because we have only really one big city. Although when you look at the local government areas, you'd have other cities like what? Like Ipswich, like Redhead, like Logan, like Gold Coast. These are not really cities, right? These are satellites of Brisbane. The third proposition I want to make is that empowering cities leads toward the world cities. And how do you empower them? The two propositions is basically what Roma was talking about, the idea of international cities based like greenfield developments, but also empowering existing cities. And remember, I talked about cities as city regions. Okay? So Toowoomba, for example, the Toowoomba region would need more empowerment in order for it to compete internationally, just like other cities are doing at the moment, in order for it to improve its economic performance and improve, of course, our well-being as citizens of this region. And the last part talks about, again, subsidiarity and how subsidiarity can inform and help empower cities. I'm 3 minutes over my time, but I will leave you with this main argument, which says basically that empowering existing and future city regions with their own charters, the way we talked about charters in the Roma clip, holds the key to an efficient and effective federal system. And of course, that means that it would have implications on Australia's economic prosperity. I will leave you with my email address and Anika's email address. If you are interested in getting these slides or the whole sort of presentation, just email us and I will send you the links. Thank you. Maybe we can then open the floor for 5 minutes, or actually we have more than 10 minutes of question and answer.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ben. This has been an exciting presentation, and a lot of passion was unloaded on the last 45 minutes. And the floor is open for questions. May I ask you to introduce yourself when you do so, if you have any? I can open the floor if you don't mind. And this is a well-known issue on this kind of analysis, because they tend to be driven by economic analysis, which in a soft term, in the sense that you're speaking about competitions. And I would like to know your opinions about culture as an element which might stimulate this kind of new city regions, or actually hinder the development of a new city regions.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. It's one of the things, as I said, this is work in progress. And we know that there are tension points in what's being proposed. And we know that there would be huge debates about it when it's proposed formally. One of them would be this idea of culture, and whether culture would actually be ready, like in Australia, for such maybe radical views. I was actually attending yesterday a workshop, a colloquium on humanities in the regions, which is under the Humanities Consortium of Humanities Research Councils centers in Australia. And you can see clearly that the crisis with the humanities, some would say that there's a crisis with the humanities, especially with funding and so on, stems really from this idea of culture and how important culture is to Australia generally, but to regional Australia. And that's why you'd find that most funding is now being drawn out from the regions and concentrated in Geo8 universities, like Brisbane, for example, University of Queensland. And why is that? So I had discussions with people yesterday about the idea of actually sending such views, such propositions. Would people actually be mentally prepared to have charter cities? It's a different story when I come to someone and say, okay, here is your freedom. I will give you this charter. So something, for example, like the charter in Hong Kong. And you can raise taxes. You can do almost everything that you want, of course, with certain limits about, for example, sovereignty, about defense, issuing maybe currencies, and so on. Would they be actually mentally prepared to take that on board? So that's why when I propose these things, I always talk about asymmetric federalism. We're not saying that everyone will have to become a charter city. It's just an option that you will make available, especially for the larger agglomerations like Sydney, like Melbourne. You know, these cities are very much capable of doing their own thing. But we can also learn from them, because you would have different approaches now, customized to local needs. So the idea of scale. You know, local government will not be always the same for on every scale. You know, a scale like Sydney could have much more different options that are available, for example, to us here, or maybe even to someone in Roma. But going back to this culture, and my sort of initial thoughts on it were that the reason why we have this lack of appreciation for culture and cultural studies that stem from humanities, I think, is because we still don't see ourselves, or we don't have this strategic intent, if you like, to become a superpower. Who is interested in culture, you see? You look at one of the most complex economies in the world, Japan. And when they came especially strong in the 70s and the 80s, what did you see coming out of Japan? It was not only their cars or their Sony Walkmans, it was also their culture. They sold us sushi. They sold us Japanese language courses, martial arts. They actually gave us their culture. And in fact, you could find now today in Australia, some of our humanities centers, much of their output is really driven by things that are coming from China. So you'd find, for example, some Chinese universities were interested in something called the Dragon Trail in Tasmania. And they wanted to actually have funding available for our scholars to do research on that. So China understands this as well. You need to actually have your culture exported. It's not just only your products and services. We don't probably seem to have that vision still in Australia. We are mostly really driven by sending out raw materials, really, without thinking what we would be, what we will have to be in 100 or 200 years. I don't think, at least, I don't think that this can be sustained. We cannot continue to just export raw materials, generally. So that's the idea of culture and the importance of culture.
Fantastic.
The other point, of course, is readying people to maybe accept some of these ideas.
Yes, fantastic. You had anything else? I can keep going. I'm really interested in these things, but
we still have like 5 more minutes, if anyone's interested.
I don't want. Okay, I take the positions of some of the representatives that are speaking about what's happened on local and regional areas, because they might be concerned that this kind of competitiveness will actually make them poorer. Effectively, their revenue will, which already you mentioned are a bit unbalanced, will be all directed to Brisbane in the situation. So if you are in a regional country, so I'm speaking about not Toowoomba, but speaking about Roma, all central Queensland will say, well, we are not really liking this idea because resources now are given in relation to needs. And what you say is a complete change of paradigm. Resources will be given to the most efficient. But we live in we're managing a very large area, and you will make us poorer, and the people who are living here even more poorer.
So again, this is the idea of taking it on an evolutionary scale. We're not saying that tomorrow someone like Toowoomba, for example, would become ready to actually compete maybe with Brisbane as charter cities. But you don't have to take up that proposition. In fact, you might be better off getting Brisbane to take that proposition so that the state actually becomes ready to sort of look at the needs of other areas rather than focusing mostly on Brisbane. Yes. But maybe in the future you could find that we would be able to innovate, and why not? We would be able to actually to find our own legal sort of systems that give us that competitive advantage, whether it's tax systems, whether it's focus on certain niche areas in innovation or research. But definitely you could see it. I was in Jena, for example, last year, which is in eastern Germany, and the University of Friedrich Schiller in Jena had sort of historical collaboration with someone called Carl Zeiss. Carl Zeiss at that time was an unknown, but later, of course, it became one of the most important lens manufacturing companies in the world. Until World War II, of course, and the first thing that happened after World War II was what? That company was plucked out of Jena and was taken to a larger city in the West. But this is my point. It's completely possible for a university like USQ to have incubation programs where we can develop actually in collaboration with local government maybe. We can develop these startups. A startup, for example, that could make documentaries. We have third-year students in arts and film, film and radio and so on. They could make a new startup on documentaries, and we can sell them to actually national and local TV networks and so on. There are many ideas, but it's this strategic intent, as I said, that takes time. It takes time, of course, to develop. But once you have that sort of meme or virus in your head, and you know that that's where we want to go, it's possible. But as long as the culture is not changed, as long as people don't see that, there's nothing wrong with the status quo. We can't actually get any better than what we have today. Then it's much more difficult, of course. But it takes time, either way.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. All right. So if we don't have anyone bursting with the desire to have questions. I think it's time to wrap the things up. Thank you very much, Ben. That was an enlightening presentation, and you're a fantastic speaker. Thank you very much. And please give your hands to Ben for this fantastic 45 minutes.